Hi, I am Dorothy Callahan, Manager of Development and Strategic Relationships for the Veteran Institute for Procurement. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Fiscal 2021 Defense Authorization Bills Compared. This webinar was developed to help veteran businesses accelerate growth in the federal marketplace. And that is what VIP is all about, accelerating the success of veteran-owned small business government contractors. And yes, it is working. On average, companies grow 63% 1 year after graduation from the VIP program and 259% growth just 2 years after graduation. VIP offers 4 different curriculums to give veteran-owned small businesses the tools they need to win government contracts. In each program, participants receive hands-on, market-based instruction that helps establish best business practices for federal government contracting. And all VIP programs are offered at no cost. We currently offer VIP Start, and that's for veteran-owned small businesses looking to become procurement ready. VIP Grow for later stage companies already selling to the federal government and looking to scale. And VIP International, which accelerates veteran-owned business success in the global marketplace. We are also excited to announce that we are launching VIP Aerospace coming in April 2021. The slides and audios from today's webinar will be made available on the VIP website at www.nationalvip.org following today's presentation. Now, I would like to welcome Bloomberg Government's Senior Data Analyst Paul Murphy and Senior Defense Analyst Robert Levinson, who will be presenting on the impending National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal 2021. They will discuss the differences between the House and Senate versions of the bill that are of particular interest to contractors, the defense authorization bills, and the impact of the continuing resolution on defense contracting, data on overall contracting as a % of the defense budget, and set-asides for service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses. Paul Murphy is a senior data analyst with Bloomberg Government. He has 30+ years of experience analyzing contract spend data for his former company, Eagle Eye Publishers, and since 2010 for VGov. He bought the first desktop contracts database to market and authored analysis for the U.S. Small Business Administration that led to billions of dollars in increased awards to small businesses. He continues to pioneer new lines of research, creating hundreds of new features and custom reports annually for Bloomberg Government clients and colleagues. Robert Levinson is an award-winning senior defense analyst with VBOC, covering defense spending, opportunities for government contractors. He is a retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force with more than 20 years of service. Prior to joining Bloomberg Government, Robert worked for Booz Allen Hamilton as a strategic communications consultant and in government relations for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. He has a bachelor's degree from the U.S. Air Force Academy and a master's from the University of California, San Diego. He is also a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government's program for our senior executives in national and international security. As you can see, you are in excellent hands with 2 of Bloomberg's top analysts. Please submit your questions throughout today's presentation in the questions box. We will address some of them at the end of today's webinar. Any questions that we cannot answer live, we will submit to Paul and Robert after the broadcast and send the answers out to you when they are available. So with that, I'm now going to turn this webinar over to Paul and Robert. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. I'm going to get started. I'm Rob Levinson. I appreciate the introduction. It's great to be with you this afternoon. I'm a veteran myself, so this is very exciting. So we're going to get started. Paul and I'll talk. I'm going to talk first for the first batch of slides, and then Paul's going to follow me. And again, the focus is on the National Defense Authorization Act. So if we could bring up the slides, please. Okay, let's Let's go to the next one, please. Let me just adjust my screen here so I can see it a little better. Okay, so as probably everybody is aware, there's two big bills that affect defense spending. There's the National Defense Authorization Act, which is passed every year, and then the appropriations bills, which appropriate the money. I know when I came to Washington, I had a little bit of difficulty understanding the difference between the two. The best description I heard is if you think of the National Defense Authorization Act as kind of a basket that sort of sets the boundaries of defense spending, and then the appropriators fill the basket to some degree with the money to pay for everything. Obviously, the National Defense Authorization Act, there's sort of two big parts. One is the money authorizing how much money can be spent on each program, and then there's usually a lot of policy issues that don't necessarily have anything to do with money, but have to do with foreign policy and the policies of the Defense Department. And we'll talk a little bit about both of those, but the money is the big one. And again, just because the NDAA authorizes something doesn't mean the appropriators have to appropriate at that level. They normally can't appropriate above the level authorized, but they can certainly appropriate below the level authorized, and sometimes they do that. Theoretically, every department is supposed to have an authorization act every year, but that doesn't happen in most cases. But the NDAA is very consistent. For 59 years straight, they have passed a National Defense Authorization Act. It's sort of one of those must-pass bills that no president and no Congress, regardless of party, wants to go without passing the bill. So as is typical, we have two versions of the bill. There's a House passed version and a Senate passed version. They will eventually go to conference, work out the differences between the two bills and send the bill to the president for signature. They have not appointed conferees yet, so the bills are kind of on hold for the moment. They may finish this up before the or after the election on November. They're not going to finish up before the election. They may finish it in what's called the lame duck section, or it may get kicked into the new year, into January. A lot of that probably is dependent upon the outcome of the election. If you could imagine, if, for example, and I'm not making any predictions or recommendations, I'm just saying, just sort of laying out the facts. But if, for example, the Democrats were to take control of the Senate or the White House or both, they might want to kick this thing into January, so they will then be able to negotiate things from a stronger power position than they can right now. Alternatively, if they don't succeed in either of those two things, the White House or the Senate, they may just assume get the bill off the table in December sometime. But there's not great differences between the House and the Senate right now, and we'll go into some of the detail. But you can see the top line is basically the same amount when it comes to the money, even though the House, of course, is controlled by the Democrats and the Senate is controlled by the Republicans. But they'll set, personnel levels, technology. They also include some things for the Coast Guard, even though the Coast Guard isn't the Department of Defense. And really the sticking points between the two bills, and the ones that will be rough in conference and perhaps rough with the White House, depending on who's president at the time it is sent to the White House, are really over the policy issues, not over the money. There is general agreement, as we'll show, on the money. And let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so these are the basic, title funding accounts that we look at. This is how the defense budget is broken down: O&M, personnel, procurement, R&D. The defense health program is broken out, and that's into a separate account. The Energy Department, a lot of the National Defense Authorization Act covers a lot of the Department of Energy, mostly the NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration, because they handle the nuclear weapons. So even though the weapons are, of course, maintained, would be used, if God forbid, by the Department of Defense, they're produced by the Energy Department, and so that portion of DOE's budget is covered by the NDAA, and of course military construction. And obviously, there have been disputes in the past over the border wall and taking money from the Milcon accounts to build the wall at the southern border, and that's been very contentious. and continues to be so. Overseas contingency operations, that's an interesting one. As many are probably aware, that really started after 9/11. The Defense Department would come every year with a emergency supplemental request to fund the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq once those operations kicked off. But eventually Congress said, could you do this in a better way and submit it with the defense budget? So they did. They called it, initially it was called GWOT, Global War on Terrorism. Then it became Overseas Contingency Operations. Initially, this was funding for war expenses that was separate. It really has evolved into kind of a slush fund. There's a lot of money, and they're very open about this. Now they call it base defense spending and then OCO spending, but now they have OCO for base. The reason that happened is in 2011, we had the Budget Control Act, and the Budget Control Act placed caps on defense spending, but it did not cap the OCO spending because it was felt you didn't want to limit the spending that might be necessary for the war. And so over time, DoD would start sticking stuff in the OCO budget that it couldn't get under the cap in the base budget. And this is true for one more year. Fiscal 2021 is the last year of the caps from the Budget Control Act. Then they expire. So it remains to be seen what will happen with OCO then. It may just get rolled into the overall defense budget because it isn't really needed anymore after that time. But as you can see, comparing the bills, we say the request, that is the request from the White House and the Department of Defense, that is submitted every February, basically. And then here's what the House has done with it, what the Senate has done. As you can see, there's really minor differences here. There's nothing hugely significant. I don't anticipate that in conference, any of these minor differences can't be worked out. These are not big heartburn, tough muscle movements for either side to come to some kind of a compromise. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, these are some of the big, pieces of hardware, and there's a little bit of differences here. Particularly, you can see the Senate wants a whole bunch more F-35s. The House is looking for 2 Virginia-class submarines, and those are incredibly expensive. So you can see the funding is about double. It's $2.3 billion from the request for 1, and in the Senate bill, and it's $4.6 billion in the House. So 2 of those, and the P-8s, Poseidon aircraft down there towards the bottom. The House wants 6 of those. Both the administration did not request any, and the Senate is not including any there as well. So again, those are kind of big, particularly the F-35s. But again, I think these can all get massaged out. The submarine one may be a tougher one because the Navy is really concerned about the number of ships it has. So it may push, in fact, for 2 Virginia-class submarines to try and get their ship levels up. The Navy has a study out, and basically they say they want 355 ships. They're now talking about 500 ships as some sort of goal out in the future. Many of those will be unmanned, but to get to that level of ships, because of course you're retiring ships all the time, you need to keep building. So the Navy may push for this extra Virginia class. We'll see what happens with that. But again, overall, there is general consensus on these things, and I don't expect that any of the money issues are going to hold up the passage of the bill when it goes to conference. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, these are research, development, technology, and evaluation. Research, development, testing, and evaluation programs in the RDT&E budget. Again, no real differences here that are of any significance at all. Should be worked out. And again, some of these, until the program is actually into the procurement phase, the money is in RDT&E, like the Air Force B-21 long-range strike bomber. That shortly, in the next couple of years, will move into the production phase, and there'll be more money as they actually start buying the aircraft. Right now, they are still developing the aircraft. The ground-based strategic deterrent, that's, again, the replacement for the Minuteman missiles that have been in operation about 50 years. That's a big program. Once that moves into procurement, those numbers will jump significantly. And then, some of these others, Army hypersonics, that's getting more and more money all the time when those move into procurement programs. So there's dollars in the R&D program, much of which goes to contractors, of course. And then once you start producing the system, the dollars go to procurement, but there still is usually R&D money all the way through those programs, as they're consistently, most of these programs we will have in the inventory for a long time. So there's a lot of upgrades, and there's still RDT&E that goes on. So there'll still be funding. But right now, things like the B-21, there's no procurement funding yet, but it's coming close within the next couple of years. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, pay raises and end strength. These are things that are typical every year. They like to give the troops a pay raise. This year is no different, a 3% pay raise. Again, minor differences in the end strength of the troops. As you can see at the bottom there, the Senate a little less than the request and the House. Again, I expect these things to all be worked out. You can see the Air Force has the Space Force embedded there. Eventually, we'll probably break out the Space Force in the fiscal 22 budget, which we should get that request in February. They may break out the Space Force in a little more detail. As the Marine Corps, the Marine Corps is still part of the Navy, Department of the Navy, but it is they break it out a little bit more. So Space Force will probably get broken out more. There's still a lot of transition going on with Space Force. You can see differences at the bottom, some of the bullets on hazardous duty pay, how much amount there, child care expenses for bases. Again, none of these are huge differences that will cause much trouble being worked out in the conference. Let's go to the next one, please. Okay, this is actually a very contentious issue. I'm sure you're all aware of the proposal to change the bases that are named for Confederate officers. There's 10 U.S. Army installations that are named after Confederate officers. And in the wake of the George Floyd and the protests and those sorts of things, there's been a push to remove those names, find other names for the bases. Both the Senate and the House bills have ways to do this. They do have different approaches, but I will tell you that the chairman of the Armed Services Committee right now in the Senate, James Inhofe from Oklahoma, opposes this effort. He did let it go through in the Senate version, but in conference he may push to have it removed. The president has threatened a veto over this measure. Remains to be seen if he would actually do that if it passed the bills. Often presidents will threaten a veto over various issues, but then the bill gets to them and they are often reluctant to issue the veto. Again, it depends too on, of course, when this bill might go to the president and who is that president. I would expect that if President Trump is defeated and President Biden were in office, he has no problem with these base names changed, so this would not be an issue. But for President Trump and for Senator Inhofe, it is an issue. So that is likely to be a very contentious issue, but that has very little to do with money. There's a couple of $1 million here for study of the issue, but really this isn't a money issue. This is a policy issue, and this can cause heartburn and could jam up the conference. If Inhofe is able to push the Senate negotiators to go hard on this issue, then it could get very contentious with the House, because the Democrats in the House believe very much in this issue. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is coronavirus related issues. And again, some of this isn't really DoD related. It's stuff shoved in here for various reasons, in the defense budget. Not a whole lot of contention on these issues either. There'll be some arm wrestling, I suspect, but in the end, I think most of these things might get worked out without too much problem. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Paul, to sort of take us through the rest of the slides. Again, please, if you have questions, submit them. We'll try and leave some time at the end for questions. And with that, over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Rob. Let's stick on coronavirus for a second. But let me just say that the NDAA is sometimes referred to as Christmas tree legislation. Legislators, as Rob pointed out, they know it's a must-pass bill, so they hang a lot of provisions on it that otherwise might not make it through committee hearings or that might get vetoed. And despite some of them being indirectly related to national security, they can nonetheless involve very significant amounts of money and have important policy implications. And in particular, they can have significant implications on small business. So let's dig into a few of these, and let's stick with this coronavirus subject for a second. The House bill includes $1 billion for a new pandemic relief fund. Chairman Adam Smith wants this provision to boost production of key medical equipment because he believes DoD's experience with acquisition and stockpile management can help manufacturers retool faster for domestic production of critical supplies and better mitigate the pandemic. Domestic production is a key theme in this NDAA. You'll see it recur over and over again, that they're trying to strengthen domestic supply chains within the United States, and it's reflected in a number of provisions. There is a small business angle here. Section 825 of the NDAA, it establishes a small business industrial base resiliency program, and it authorizes DoD to purchase goods and services from small businesses in direct response to COVID-19. So think of small business when you think of coronavirus spending in the NDAA. The House bill includes language calling for the use of the Defense Production Act to direct manufacturers to produce more personal protective equipment. And as you may know, DPA authorizes the president to require acceptance of contracts, requires the acceptance and preferential performance of contracts and orders that are deemed necessary to promote national defense. The House and Senate both include language providing National Guard members with traditional health care if they've been supporting the government's response to the pandemic. The House has language, and here's where we get into kind of indirect provisions. The House has language that would suspend private student loan payments and interest accrual through September 2021. And the House bill would provide $10,000 in assistance for private student loan borrowers. It would allow international students to take classes online in fulfillment of their student visa requirements. Perhaps this will affect some of your employees. This online provision was requested by Representative Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts, who represents most of Cambridge, Massachusetts. So you can understand her interests there. The Senate has no similar language in their bill. The Senate would waive progress payments on what are called undefinitized contracts during the pandemic. To meet urgent needs, DoD can issue what are called undefinitized contract actions, or UCAs, that authorize vendors to begin work before reaching a final agreement on contract terms and prices. The contractor has little incentive to control costs during this period, which creates the potential for waste. So this proposal would potentially speed up the contracting process, but it could also raise the possibility of wasted taxpayer dollars. So it's some concern there, and the House and Senate need to work out language. The Senate bill would also direct the Department of Energy to make its unclassified high-performance computers available for COVID-19 research, so long as they don't negatively impact the stockpile stewardship mission of the National Nuclear Security Administration. Rob spoke about the defense component of DOE, and this is related to that. DOE maintains high-performance computers at several of their labs, including Los Alamos, Sandia, and Livermore. Next slide, please. Slide 9, foreign policy. Interesting topic. The House authorizes $3.5 billion to support allies in the Indo-Pacific region. The Senate authorizes $6.9 billion over 2 years to defend U.S. interests in the same region. Both the House and the Senate have agreed that they need to prioritize this region in order to counter aggressive moves by China. The Senate version of the bill begins funding for what's called the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which looks at the defense budget through more of a regional warfighting lens. The Senate would focus money on developing technologies appropriate for that theater and fielding high-end systems west of the international dateline. The House version would use funds to strengthen alliances with countries in the region in an effort to force China to play by the rules. House leaders are more worried about fueling an Indo-Pacific arms race. The House language would ban export licenses for defense articles to Hong Kong police until the president certified they haven't violated human rights for a year. And the Senate has similar language, so not much difference there. The House has language that would extend the ban on transferring Guantanamo Bay detainees to Libya, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Again, the Senate has a very similar language, so probably quick resolution in conference. The House has an interesting provision that would bar infrastructure grants through 2023 to any countries that have violated U.S. intellectual property rights. The Senate has no similar language. So this gets back to my point that the DoD is taking steps to, or the House rather, through the Department of Defense Authorization Act, is taking steps to protect U.S. contractors and U.S. supply chains, protect their intellectual property, particularly with contracts that may be supply equipment overseas or may be performed overseas. And finally, the Senate authorizes no less than $3.3 billion annually for security assistance to Israel from fiscal 2021 through 2028. We're entering right now in fiscal 2021 the third year of funding under the 2016 Memorandum of Understanding between the U.S. and Israel that committed the U.S. to pay $38 billion in military aid to Israel over 10 years. In the MOU, the Senate provision would codify Israeli military assistance and make part of the 2000 Military Assistance Act. For context, this comes just a month after Israel committed to normalizing relations with two Arab states, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, as part of the Abraham Accords. And at that time, the Trump administration voiced support for selling F-35s to UAE. And in his meetings in Washington at that time, Benjamin Netanyahu was reported to have requested $8 billion in new arms purchases, including a squadron of Lockheed's F-35s, a couple of Boeing KC-46 refueling tankers, and Boeing's V-22 tilt rotor aircraft. The House wants to go slow to avoid a Middle East arms race and an escalation of tensions with Iran, which is furious over Bahrain's and UAE's cooperation with Israel. And interesting, I did a little keyword scan, and the House bill has 53 references to the word Yemen in the full text, and the Senate bill has 0. So there are some policy differences here, and it reflects different approaches the House and the Senate are taking to key foreign policy issues that have defense implications. So there's probably going to be some discussion there. Next slide, please. Slide 10, space capabilities. The House authorizes $2.5 billion in base O&M funding for the U.S. Space Force, and it creates a Chief of Space Operations office within the Air Force to support the Space Force. The Senate, essentially the same terms. And what it means, though, is basically Congress is moving ahead with the administration's plan for this 6th armed force that Rob is talking about. Space Force was created in December 2019 with the passage of the 2020 NDAA. And a Space Force will be headed by a Chief of Space Operations, and it'll fall under the Air Force as of now, kind of like the way the Marine Corps comes under the Navy, as Rob described. The Space Force's mission is to protect U.S. security in space, and it'll handle most, if not all, of DoD's space-related procurements. Keep an eye on Space Force. They're starting to spend a lot of money. It's showing up in our contracts database. They spent nearly $1 billion on federally funded research development centers this past year, and it was part of my technology and engineering services profile, the recent one we just published. So a lot of spending starting to emerge out of the U.S. Space Force. The House authorizes as much as $450 million for Air Force Phase 3 national security space launch requirements. This is interesting. NSSL is a program designed to ensure DoD's ongoing access to space, and it supersedes the Evolved Expenditure Launch Vehicle program that was active for 15 years between 1994 and 2019. The NSSL provisions of the House bill set a September 30th, 2021 deadline for the Air Force to sign 3 agreements with national security space launch providers. There's a lot happening in the U.S. space launch industry. For instance, just this past September, the Space Force signed the first ever agreement with SpaceX for a reusable booster to launch defense satellites into space. And earlier this year, VOX, a subsidiary of Virgin Orbit, received a task order for 3 launches of its Launcher 1 rocket that'll deliver 44 small satellites into low Earth orbit. So the Senate's seeking to increase NSL spending, and both chambers are expected to come to quick agreement on this provision. And finally, the Senate requires DoD to certify to Congress that a Space National Guard is suited to complete missions before it can be created. Next slide, please. Cybersecurity. Both the House and the Senate would bar new procurement contracts with any entity that doesn't participate in a new threat intelligence information sharing program. Also, the House and Senate both agreed to require risk mitigation before locating major weapons systems in countries with at-risk 5 or 6G equipment. Again, that theme of trying to protect the U.S. supply chain, U.S. Intellectual property, so that it doesn't leak to foreign countries and present security risks. There's some unique language in the House bill that would allow U.S. nationals to seek damages from foreign governments in U.S. courts related to cyber attacks by those countries. Some additional unique language in the House bill would require the president to launch a national artificial intelligence initiative. This language would create a new office and interagency committee to support research, education, training, and the creation of public-private partnerships to support the commercialization of IT. It also calls for the creation of a network of AI research institutes. So something to keep in mind with this NDAA bill, if you're a vendor, is that some of these provisions don't necessarily have explicit amounts of money or even large amounts of money attached to them, but they plant the seeds of long-term initiatives that could have a tremendous impact on spending priorities and your business, if in this case you're involved in artificial intelligence. The Senate bill has some unique language that would allow DoD to provide financial support to manufacturing extension centers that are overseen by the National Institute of Standards and Technology in order to support the delivery of cybersecurity services for small manufacturers. And here's another instance where some provisions are designed explicitly to benefit small businesses, in this case in the cybersecurity industry. And Senate language would repeal the sunset of Cyber Command Acquisition Authority for what's called peculiar equipment and capabilities. It's not quite clear what peculiar equipment is, but it's probably something that's unique and context sensitive. It would also repeal a $75 million cap on that for that authority for peculiar equipment. And something I'd just like to add to the discussion of this slide, if I could quickly, a couple of provisions that we didn't bullet, and they're both Senate provisions. And one has to do with artificial intelligence. It would require DoD to identify at least 5 use cases for existing AI systems to support management-related functions like enterprise acquisitions, auditing, financial management. The DoD would be required to develop prototypes, AI prototypes, that leverage commercially available AI technologies to pursue these use cases. And the other one has to do with quantum computing. Each branch of the military would have to maintain lists of technical problems that could be addressed by quantum computers within the next 3 years and pursue agreements with small and medium-sized quantum computing businesses to facilitate research on these programs. So this, again, addresses this issue that they're trying to strengthen the U.S. industrial base. They're targeting small businesses, and they're trying to bring what are called non-traditional vendors into the federal marketplace. And perhaps if we have time or if there's questions, Rob could talk more about OTAs, other transaction authority type agreements that we're covering extensively at Bloomberg that relate a lot to developing, to R&D and developing prototypes for cutting edge technology. And some of them start right here with small provisions for pilots and items that don't look like they have a lot of money attached to them. But if you flag them, if you keyword search them, and you keep going back to them over and over again with whatever market intelligence you're using, we hope it's Bloomberg, of course, but whatever market intelligence source you're using, keep an eye on these initiatives, these seemingly unpaid initiatives in the NDAA. Slide 12, please. Next slide. Here we have other provisions. Quickly, the House and Senate both agree on requiring vetting of foreign nationals seeking access to military installations. They agree on requiring agencies to follow additional procedures in discrimination claims. And interestingly, keep an eye on this one, they require that it would create semiconductor industry manufacturing incentive grants worth up to $3 billion. And that's a significant amount of money if you're in the semiconductor industry. There could be some grants emerging out of this bill. The House bill has some unique language funding the Coast Guard and the Federal Maritime Commission. They'd be reauthorized through fiscal 2021. The House is proposing $8.4 billion for the Coast Guard, including $3.31 billion for procurement in fiscal 2021. Well, what is the Coast Guard procuring? Well, it could include funding for instance, for new icebreakers for the Great Lakes and the polar regions, which is heating up, no pun intended, but it's becoming an area of contention as the ice melts and shipping lanes need to be patrolled, and DoD's mission is extending into the polar regions, and so they need icebreakers. Currently, 6 of the 9 icebreakers on the Great Lakes are over 30 years old, and they are essential for keeping commercial shipping lanes open throughout the year. So DoD plays a role in the commerce of particularly the Midwestern states around the Great Lakes. The House bill has unique language that would authorize State Department embassy security, construction, and maintenance. And the Senate has unique language that would authorize intelligence programs for fiscal 2021. And I'll just briefly touch on that. The intelligence budget has 2 major components: the National Intelligence Program and the Military Intelligence Program. NIP budgets fund the intelligence community organizations. MIP budgets fund intelligence organizations within DoD. Except for some unclassified expenditures for things like retirement plans, the fiscal 2021 intelligence budget is not disclosed. But the Director of National Intelligence, DNI, publishes a summary budget on its budget site. Believe it or not, DNI has a budget site. And for 2020, DNI reports that the budget was $62.8 billion. Last year's budget was $62.8 billion, including overseas contingency operations. So this is a significant amount of money, and it's worth tracking, and there are ways to track some intelligence spending, but also opportunities that are emerging as well. And finally, the Senate would transfer authority over the National Intelligence University from DoD to DNI and allow it to award degrees. It would also authorize DNI to award grants to schools and run national competitions to promote STEM skills. Again, getting to what kinds of activities would strengthen the U.S. industrial base, particularly in the area of engineering and technology. Finally, last slide, 13. Veteran-owned business spending. It hit a 20-year peak in 2019. When Congress finishes the authorization and appropriations process and gives DoD its money to obligate for contracts and all the other things it spends money on, this is how VOB contract spending looks when it's broken down geographically in fiscal 2019. The big picture is that in 2019, VOB spending, or revenues, I guess, hit an all-time high of $17 billion. The fiscal 2019 total was 31% higher than DoD VOB spending in fiscal 2015. So it's gone up 31%, almost a third in 5 years. When you display the data on the map, the first thing you notice is that much of the VOB contract spending is concentrated in the DC, Maryland, and the Virginia area. Spending in these states accounted for 31% of all DoD spending in fiscal 2019. The top 10 states accounted for 70% of all DoD VOB spending. And I said 31% of all DoD spending. I believe it should be 31% of all DoD VOB spending. Top 10, 70% of all VOB spending. Although fiscal 2020 just finished at the end of September, DoD reports its contract data on a 90-day delay, so we won't have full DoD spending totals for fiscal 20 until January of next year. But this starts to give you an idea of how you can begin to leverage all of this budget and contract data. When you look at what DoD is funding through its budget, the contract data tells you how much of that translates into spending with VOBs, which organizations are spending that money, what markets it is spending the money in, and what items it's spending the money for, and clearly where in the country they are spending this money. There are literally hundreds of ways to break DoD spending out in our contracts database by VOB, and also service-related disabled veteran-owned business set-asides. There's recompetes, there's breakouts by competitors. You can also use it to just understand how and with whom DoD is spending its money. So when you're ready to start your market research program, or even if you have one right now, please keep us in mind, Bloomberg Government, because we can help you sort it all out. So with that, I will turn it back over to our moderator and invite questions.
Paul, thank you very much. Rob, thank you as well. We did have 2 questions here. So it says we are interested in NGREA funding for the National Guard and Reserve. Specifically, we'd like to know if NGREA funding is currently reflected in both House and Senate versions of the NDAA. If yes, what is the account? And is there any idea of risk that the funding will be pre-programmed following appropriations as it was last year? I think you're on mute.
On mute. Sorry about that. I'm not sure about the pre-programming question. I would have to research that. I'm not exactly sure what that means by pre-programming, but there is funding normally for the National Guard is included in the NDAAs as it is included in the appropriations bills. So it is certainly there. It should be easily identifiable in the bills separately. Oftentimes they break it down. In other words, it'll say, it'll be broken. The bills tend to be broken down by those titles. So research and development, procurement, RD, personnel, and then broken down by service. So you have to kind of look at it that way in the bills. But I'm not aware of any sort of difficulties or big disputes between the 2 houses on any National Guard funding. Paul, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think it would require additional research on our part. I mean, I'm in the House bill right now, and there are hundreds of references, or 146 references to the phrase National Guard. So it's clearly covered in the bill. I think it's the same way in the Senate bill. We'd have to look at the specific accounts to see, what is allocated for National Guard and how that breaks down. I
know there's some discussion of developing a National Guard for the Space Force, and the houses are considering. There's some language looking at studying or recommending whether or not Space Force should have a National Guard component. But I think at this point it's just being studied.
Yeah, the Senate had that clause about they wanted to make sure it was ready to go before they awarded funding, so there may not be Space Force funding explicitly in the budget this year.
So do you think that what effect will the CRA have on the timing of obligation of the NGREA, if any? Do you think
the timing of the continuing resolution? Is that what is being asked?
Yeah, what effect will the CRA have on the timing of the obligation?
Oh, well, the continuing resolution, the way those work is you basically spend at last year's rate you can't start any new programs. Most of the National Guard funding is O&M funding. I mean, there may be some new starts in terms of procurement or things like that. So, you know, those any new starts will be delayed until there is a budget. But the O&M funding, the operational funding, is basically continuing it at last year's rate.
Take myself off. Could you also provide more information in, in the NDAA on Section 825, small business manufacturing?
Paul, can you got that in front of you?
Let me pull it up. See if I can actually read it to you.
We've been told by the SBA that the NDAA revises small business vendor protege program and joint venture regulations, and when will that be in effect? So I'm sorry, take one question at a time, right?
Well, in terms of when it will be in effect is, you know, obviously they have to pass the bill and have the bill signed by the president. So, and then it may have a date. Again, Paul is looking up the language, but it may say in the bill, you know, when this will be in effect. It may be like 90 days from the signing of the bill. But also, oftentimes with regulation, if it's a new regulation or a change to regulation, it gets passed in the bill, but then they have to, you know, whatever agency, it's DOD or SBA in this case, has to draft a new rule, and they have to put it out for comment, and then people comment, and then they draft a final rule. So it can take some time before these things actually become implemented. I know, Paul, are you able to find the language there?
We'll have to get back to the question, Rob. I can get to Section 825. The answer is not jumping off the page at me at the moment.
So we can get back. Yeah, that'll be fine. Paul, thank you. Let's see, next question we have from Chelsea is, I've been told by the SBAA that the NDAA revises small business vendor protege program and joint venture regulations. When will that be in effect?
Okay, that I think we
have to do.
Again, the bill has to pass. There may be a date in the bill for when that occurs, but usually, if it's any kind of a change in regulation, the SBA has to put out a change in the regulation. There's a comment period, so it can take months before it actually comes into effect, even after the bill is passed.
Or even years. The Runway Extension Act took many months, and there was an extended comment period, and the SBA did an extensive analysis on their own, which also, you know, got commented on. So you know, timing is difficult to predict.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if as Paul mentioned, whenever if something is very contentious and there's lots of comments and industry has a lot of input into it, then it's going to take longer, because the government does try and accommodate the industry concerns that are raised in comments. And so if there's heavy opposition or heavy concern, then that drags out the process.
Okay. So, Paul, you did mention about OTAs. You kind of brought that up and thought Rob could probably touch on that a little bit. So, Rob, I'm sure a lot of folks are curious about the OTAs.
Yes. Okay, so OTA stands for Other Transaction Agreement or Other Transaction Authority. They use the two terms interchangeably. Basically what these are, they were actually set up in 1957 when Sputnik went up and they wanted to give NASA a lot more flexibility and latitude in contracts. They set up this Other Transaction Authority, which basically waives a whole bunch of rules that are normally in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the DFAR or the FAR. A lot of them are waived, and it's mostly for prototype and advanced technology. So it was originally created for NASA. Other agencies were allowed to use it, but it kind of fell by the wayside after a time period. And then in about the past 5 or 6 years, DoD has really revived it and started to use it more and more. And they set up, oftentimes money goes through what they call consortia, which are these groups of companies. You pay like normally about $500 a year to join. And then they put out requests for white papers for various research and development projects. And it's a very quick response. You sort of send in a 10-page white paper. The government looks at the responses and throws some money at contractors. They're supposed to be primarily for non-traditional contractors, so smaller businesses or people who haven't been in the DoD business very much. Although big companies can get them, Lockheed gets a lot of them, but they still have to have a lot of small business participation, non-traditional. I shouldn't say small business, although by definition, small businesses fall into the non-traditional category, but non-traditional participation. So even if it's a big project, there has to be a teaming arrangement. In fiscal 2020, we saw HHS, in combating the COVID crisis, jump in with both feet. There were 4 big HHS contracts for over $1 billion using OTA. So again, it's a way of being very flexible, very fast. Congress is very enthusiastic about it. DoD's been using it more and more. It is also possible to even use it for production contracts. We haven't seen as much of that, but more and more DoD is pushing the envelope on this. And we may see HHS, if they have to produce a vaccine, use them as well, because it's so much faster and less bureaucratic than the traditional FAR. And we track these very heavily. We track, there's 28 different consortia that we track at BGov. Although the best way to know what's going on in the consortia, you have to join them. Again, it's normally only about $500 a year. And they're organized around different topics. There's one for space. There's one for shipbuilding, electronic warfare. There's a variety of them. I know, Paul, do you want to add anything?
No, you covered, except that we do have a dashboard that tracks the OTA spending. What's different about the data in our dashboard versus the contracts is that we're able to trace the spending down to the individual recipients in the consortia, so we can provide a little bit more detail and insight into how these awards made through consortia are being spread across what are called non-traditional actors, particularly in the R&D and prototyping stages of a procurement.
Great. Well, thank you. I don't see any other questions, and I know we have probably about kind of come to the conclusion of the webinar. So thank you, Paul and Robert, for this important presentation on the fiscal 2021 defense authorization bills compared. And thank you to the Small Business Administration, the Veterans Business of Outreach Centers. Without their generous support, this webinar series would not be possible. As mentioned in the beginning of today's broadcast, a video recording of this presentation will be made available later this afternoon on the VIP website. I would like to ask that you take a moment to complete a very short survey that will be sent to you immediately following this program. Your feedback is very important to us. Again, thank you for your participation today, and we wish you all continued success. Paul, Robert, thank you very much, and thank you to all the attendees.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Yeah,
Okay,
thanks very
thank
much.
you.